Family trip, clean the house. The card said, sitting right next to my plate like it belonged there. Like it was just another side dish among the cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes. And for a moment, I thought maybe I was reading it wrong. Maybe my eyes at 68 weren't as sharp as they used to be. But no, the ink was clear, bold, deliberate, and unmistakably meant for me. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small, a simple folded piece of cardstock, could make the entire room feel colder than the November air outside. I picked it up between my fingers, careful, almost gentle, as if it might fall apart. And I smiled, not because I found it funny, but because after a lifetime of hosting Thanksgivings, of setting tables and carving turkeys and making sure everyone else felt at home, I had learned that sometimes a smile was the only thing that kept the cracks from showing. The dining room looked exactly as it always had, warm light reflecting off the polished oak table, the good china laid out in perfect symmetry, the kind I only used once a year, the kind my late husband used to insist made everything feel proper. And for a second I could almost hear his voice telling me not to worry, that everything would be all right. But his chair was empty now, had been for 3 years, and the silence around it had grown louder with each passing holiday. Across from me, Ashley was adjusting the napkin in her lap, her movements neat and controlled, her expression pleasant in that way that never quite reached her eyes. And beside her, my son Daniel was pouring himself another glass of wine, avoiding my gaze with a precision that felt practiced, like he had already decided which side of the table he belonged to long before I ever picked up that card. No one said anything about it, not at first, and that was the part that settled deepest in my chest. The way the conversation continued as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just been handed instructions like I was staff instead of family. And I realized then that this wasn't a joke that had gone too far or a misunderstanding that needed clearing up. It was something quieter, something planned, something that had likely been discussed in this very room when I wasn't there. I set the card back down beside my plate, aligning it carefully with the edge of the silverware, the way I used to line up Daniel's school lunches when he was a boy, and I took a sip of water to steady my hands, noticing how even the smallest details seemed sharper now. The clink of glass against the table, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of a car passing by outside, all of it, grounding me in a moment that felt strangely distant from the life I thought I had. "Dinner smells great, Mom," Daniel said finally, his voice casual, almost too casual, and I nodded, because what else was there to do? Because correcting him wouldn't change the fact that the warmth in his words didn't match the coldness in his silence. And Ashley smiled at him. A quick, approving glance that lasted just long enough to be noticed, just short enough to be denied. I reached for the serving spoon. My movements steady, practiced, automatic, and I served the turkey the way I always had, starting with Daniel, then Ashley, then myself last, because some habits don't break easily, even when the meaning behind them has shifted. "Are you excited for the trip?" Ashley asked, her tone light, conversational, as if the card hadn't already answered that question for me. And Daniel nodded, launching into details about flights and reservations, about a beach house somewhere in Florida, about plans that had clearly been made well in advance, plans that somehow hadn't required my input or even my awareness, and I listened, because listening had always been easier than asking questions that no one wanted to answer. The words washed over me, blending into the background like the soft music playing from the old radio in the corner, and I found myself focusing instead on the small things, the way Ashley's hand rested on Daniel's arm, the way he leaned slightly toward her when he spoke, the way their laughter filled the spaces that used to belong to something else, something that felt more like family and less like performance. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the faint tremor in my fingers settle into stillness, and I realized that whatever this was, whatever role they had quietly assigned me, it hadn't started tonight. It hadn't started with that card. It had been building for years in moments I had dismissed, in silences I had ignored, in choices I had explained away because it was easier to believe in accidents than in intentions. I smiled again, softer this time, not for them, but for myself, because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't confused about what I was seeing. And there was a certain clarity in that, a certain calm that came from understanding exactly where you stood, even if that place wasn't where you thought it would be. And as I looked around the table I had set with such care, at the people I had spent decades putting first. I realized that the card hadn't just told me what they expected from me. It had shown me who they believed I was, and that, more than anything else, was something I intended to remember. The dishes were cleared the same way they always had been, quietly, efficiently, as if the rhythm of the evening had not shifted at all, and I carried the plates to the kitchen one by one, feeling the weight of each one settle into my hands just a little heavier than before, the porcelain cool against my palms, the faint scent of roasted turkey and rosemary still clinging to the air, and I noticed how neither Daniel nor Ashley made any move to follow me, how their voices continued behind me in low conversation that softened the moment I stepped out of the room, as if I had taken something with me that allowed them to speak more freely. I stood at the sink and turned on the faucet, watching the water run for a second longer than necessary, letting the steady sound fill the silence that had followed me into the kitchen, and for a brief moment I closed my eyes, not out of exhaustion but out of habit, the same small pause I used to take years ago when the house was full and noisy and I needed a second to gather myself before stepping back into the center of it all. Only now, there was nothing waiting on the other side except the understanding that I had somehow moved to the edges of my own home. I picked up the first plate and began to rinse it, slow and deliberate, the way I had done thousands of times before, and I remembered other Thanksgivings, ones where Daniel would hover nearby, asking if I needed help even when he was too young to do much more than dry a fork or carry a napkin, and I remembered how proud I had been of him, how I had believed that those small gestures meant something lasting, something that would stay with him as he grew older. But memory has a way of softening the past, of polishing it until it looks brighter than it ever truly was. And standing there at the sink, I wondered when exactly those gestures had stopped, when helping had turned into watching, and when watching had turned into looking away entirely. The water grew warmer, steam rising faintly into the air, and I reached for the dish towel, folding it neatly over the edge of the counter as I always did, because routine had always been my way of holding things together. Even when the meaning behind those routines began to shift, and I could hear Ashley laughing again from the dining room, a light, effortless sound that carried just enough to reach me without inviting me back, and I realized that it was not the laughter itself that unsettled me. It was the absence of space for me within it. I dried the plate and set it carefully in the rack, aligning it with the others, each one placed just so, and I caught my reflection in the small window above the sink, the glass dark against the night outside. And for a moment I studied the woman looking back at me, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her posture still straight despite the years, her expression composed in a way that had taken a lifetime to master. And I thought about how often I had told myself that composure was strength, that keeping the peace was the same as protecting it. But there is a difference between maintaining harmony and erasing yourself to preserve it, and I could not remember the last time I had asked myself which one I had been doing. The conversation in the other room shifted again, quieter now, and I turned off the faucet, letting the sudden silence settle around me. And I found myself listening more carefully, not because I wanted to intrude, but because something in the tone of their voices had changed, a subtle tightening that suggested a different kind of discussion, one not meant for general hearing, and I moved just slightly closer to the doorway, not enough to be seen, just enough to catch a few stray words carried by the stillness of the house. "She will manage," Ashley said, her voice lower now, more measured, and Daniel responded with something I could not quite make out, followed by a pause that stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, and then Ashley again. "It is only for a week, and it needs to be done anyway." And I felt something inside me settle into place, not a sharp realization, not a sudden shock, but a quiet confirmation of what I had already begun to understand at the table, that this was not a misunderstanding or a careless oversight. It was an arrangement, one that had been decided and agreed upon without me, one that had simply been presented to me as if my role within it had always been obvious. I stepped back from the doorway before the silence could shift again, before the conversation could move into something even more specific, and I returned to the sink, picking up another plate, my hands steady, my movements unchanged, because outwardly nothing had to change yet, not tonight, not in a way that would invite questions I was not ready to answer. And as I continued to wash and dry and place each piece back where it belonged, I allowed myself to think not about what they had said, but about what they had assumed, about the certainty in Ashley's voice, about the quiet acceptance in Daniel's, and I realized that whatever place they had assigned me, whatever role they believed I would continue to play, it was built on a version of me that no longer existed, and that understanding did not come with anger or even with sadness. It came with something far more useful, a clarity that sharpened each thought, that steadied each breath, that turned the simple act of standing at my own kitchen sink into the beginning of something I had not yet fully named but already recognized as necessary. The last plate clicked softly into place, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter as the house settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that follows a meal but does not quite feel like peace. And I could hear the faint rustle of movement from the living room now, the low murmur of voices blending with the sound of the television being turned on, as if the evening were continuing exactly as it should, as if nothing had shifted at all. I dried my hands slowly, pressing the towel between my fingers, feeling the fabric absorb the last traces of warmth, and I realized how easily life rearranges itself around small changes, how quickly people adjust when something becomes convenient for them. And I wondered how long this arrangement had been forming, how many conversations had taken place just out of my hearing, how many decisions had been made with the quiet assumption that I would accept them without question. I walked toward the living room, not hurried, not hesitant, simply moving the way I always had in my own home. And as I stepped into the doorway, I saw them seated together on the couch, Daniel leaning back with a glass in his hand, Ashley curled slightly toward him, her posture relaxed, comfortable, like someone who had already secured her place in the room, and they both looked up when they noticed me, their expressions shifting just enough to acknowledge my presence without inviting it, a small adjustment that might have gone unnoticed if I had not been paying attention. "Everything is taken care of in the kitchen," I said, my voice even, measured, and Daniel nodded, offering a brief smile that did not quite reach his eyes, the same smile he had used earlier, the one that felt more like a gesture than a feeling, and Ashley tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into something polite, something practiced, as if she were acknowledging a task completed rather than a person standing in front of her. I moved to the armchair near the window, the one I had always favored, and I sat down with the same quiet care I had used all evening, noticing how the cushion dipped beneath me in a familiar way, how the fabric still carried the faint scent of the lavender spray I used every few weeks, small details that reminded me this space was still mine, even if its meaning had begun to change. The television cast a soft glow across the room, flickering light over their faces, over the walls, over the framed photographs that lined the shelves, and I let my gaze rest on those photographs for a moment, on the images of birthdays and holidays and ordinary days that had once felt significant simply because we were all together, and I found myself studying them more closely than I had in years, noticing things I had overlooked before, the way Ashley had gradually moved closer to the center of each frame, the way Daniel's posture had shifted, the way I had remained at the edges, present but no longer central, a quiet observer in scenes I had once orchestrated. "We will be leaving early on Sunday," Ashley said suddenly, her voice cutting gently through the background noise, and I turned my attention back to her, meeting her gaze without hesitation, and she continued, "There is a list on the counter of a few things that might need attention while we are gone, nothing complicated, just the usual upkeep." And there it was again, not a request, not even a suggestion, but an expectation delivered with the ease of something already decided, and I nodded, not because I agreed, but because acknowledging her words cost me nothing in that moment, and because I was beginning to understand that what mattered was not what I said now, but what I chose to do later. Daniel shifted slightly beside her, setting his glass down on the coffee table, and for a brief second he glanced in my direction, his expression unreadable, as if something behind his eyes had flickered and then been quickly covered. And I wondered if he saw it too, the change that had taken place, the line that had been quietly crossed, or if he had simply learned to look past it the way people do when something benefits them. I folded my hands in my lap, resting them lightly one over the other, and I felt a calm settle over me that was different from the one I had carried earlier, less about maintaining appearances and more about holding on to something solid within myself, something that did not depend on their understanding or their approval. and I realized that clarity has a way of reshaping even the smallest moments, of turning an ordinary evening into something that feels almost deliberate, almost purposeful. The room grew quieter again, the conversation drifting into something trivial, something easy, and I allowed it to pass around me without effort, without resistance, because I no longer felt the need to fill the silence or to smooth over the spaces between us. And as I sat there, watching the light shift across the walls, listening to the steady rhythm of voices that no longer included me in the same way, I understood that whatever came next would not be decided at this table or in this room. It would be decided in the quiet moments that followed, in the choices made without announcement, in the actions that did not require permission. And for the first time that evening, the thought did not feel heavy. It felt steady, like something I could carry forward without needing to set it down. I did not go to bed right away that night. Even though the house had gone quiet and the television had been turned off, and the soft creak of the stairs told me that Daniel and Ashley had already retreated to their room, leaving the rest of the house in that familiar stillness that used to feel comforting but now felt more like a space waiting to be understood, and I remained in the armchair by the window for a while longer, watching the reflection of the room settle into the glass, the faint outline of furniture blending with the darkness outside, until I finally stood and made my way slowly down the hallway, my steps measured, unhurried, as if I had all the time in the world. The bedroom door closed quietly behind me, and I did not turn on the overhead light, choosing instead the small lamp by the bedside, the one that cast a softer glow, the kind my husband used to prefer when he would read before sleep. And I paused for a moment, letting that light settle over the room, over the dresser, over the neatly folded blankets, over the photograph that still sat on the nightstand, his smile, captured in a way that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. I sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing my hand over the fabric beside me, and I found myself thinking back, not just to the years when he was here, but to the promises he had made in quiet conversations that seemed almost casual at the time, assurances about the house, about security, about making sure I would never have to worry. And I remembered how I had nodded, trusting that those things were understood, that they were as solid as the walls around us. And yet now, sitting there in the same room, I realized how easily understanding can be reshaped when it is not written down, when it exists only in memory and assumption. I stood again and walked to the dresser, opening the top drawer with a familiarity that required no thought, and inside, beneath neatly arranged scarves and small keepsakes, was a folder I had not touched in months, perhaps longer, and I lifted it carefully, feeling the slight stiffness of the paper within, the quiet weight of documents that had once seemed like something for another time, something distant, something that did not require immediate attention. I carried the folder back to the bed and sat down, placing it in my lap, and for a moment I simply rested my hands on top of it, not opening it right away, allowing myself to feel the shift that had taken place over the course of the evening. The way uncertainty had given way to something more defined, something that did not rely on guesswork or interpretation. And when I finally opened it, the papers inside were exactly as I remembered, neatly organized, clearly labeled, the language precise in a way that left little room for doubt. I read through them slowly, not because I needed to decipher anything, but because I wanted to see each detail again with the clarity I now carried, the lines that outlined ownership, the provisions that had been set in place, the signatures that made it official. And as I moved from one page to the next, I felt a quiet steadiness settle deeper within me, the kind that does not come from emotion but from understanding, from knowing exactly where things stand regardless of what others might believe. I closed the folder gently and set it beside me on the bed, my fingers lingering on the edge for just a moment before I withdrew my hand. And I thought about the list Ashley had mentioned, the one sitting on the counter, the tasks she had already decided I would take care of, and I could almost see it in my mind, written in that same neat, deliberate style she applied to everything. A list that likely included details about cleaning, about maintenance, about making sure everything was in order for their return, and I realized how confident she must have felt when she wrote it, how certain she was that I would follow it without question, that I would step into the role she had assigned without hesitation. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just slightly to look out at the yard, the faint outline of the garden visible under the dim porch light. The same garden I had tended year after year, planting, pruning, maintaining, not because anyone asked me to, but because it was part of how I cared for this place, part of how I expressed belonging. And as I stood there, looking out at something that had always felt like mine, I understood that what had changed was not the house itself, not the space or the objects within it, but the way it was being perceived by others, the way my place within it had been quietly redefined without my consent. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward the bed, the folder still resting there where I had left it. And I picked it up once more, holding it with a firmer grip this time, not out of tension but out of recognition, because it was no longer just a collection of documents. It was a reminder of something that had been established long before this evening, something that had not shifted simply because others chose to ignore it, and I placed it carefully on the nightstand, within reach, not hidden away, not tucked out of sight, but present in a way that felt intentional. When I finally lay down, I did not feel the restlessness that often follows a difficult day. There was no turning back and forth, no replaying of conversations or searching for different words I might have said, because there was nothing I needed to change about what had already happened. And as I closed my eyes, I realized that whatever came next would not be about reacting to their expectations. It would be about deciding my own, quietly, deliberately, in a way that did not require explanation. And that thought settled over me with a calm that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. A calm that suggested that the balance of this house had already begun to shift, even if no one else had noticed yet. The next morning arrived with a quiet kind of clarity that I had not felt in a long time. The kind that settles in before the sun fully rises, when the house is still and the air feels untouched, and I woke earlier than usual without needing an alarm, my eyes opening to the soft gray light filtering through the curtains. And for a moment, I simply lay there, listening to the silence, not the heavy silence from the night before, but something lighter, something that felt like a beginning rather than an ending. I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the floor with deliberate care, and I noticed how steady my hands felt, how there was no lingering hesitation in my movements, no second-guessing, just a quiet sense of purpose that carried me through the simple routine of getting dressed and making my way downstairs. The kitchen looked exactly as I had left it, clean, orderly, every surface in place. And the list Ashley had mentioned was sitting on the counter, positioned neatly in the center, as if it had been placed there to be seen immediately. And I walked toward it without rushing, my steps measured, my posture straight. And I picked it up, holding it at eye level as I read through each line. The handwriting was precise, controlled, each task written as if it were part of a schedule already set in motion. Reminders about vacuuming, about organizing storage spaces, about checking on small repairs that could easily wait, all presented with a tone that assumed compliance, that assumed I would follow through without question, and I felt no anger as I read it, no surge of emotion, only a quiet acknowledgement of what it represented. And when I finished, I folded the paper carefully, not crumpling it, not dismissing it, but placing it back down exactly where it had been, aligned with the edge of the counter the same way I had aligned the card the night before. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the early morning light settle over the yard, the faint shimmer of dew on the grass, the stillness of the garden that had not yet been disturbed. And I thought about how many mornings I had stood in this exact spot, planning my day around the needs of others, making lists of my own that revolved around keeping everything running smoothly, making sure that nothing fell out of place. And I realized how easily those habits had been taken for granted, how invisible they had become, until they were suddenly expected without acknowledgement. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle, and I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me, followed by the low murmur of voices as Daniel and Ashley made their way into the kitchen, their movements unhurried, their tone casual, as if the evening before had been entirely uneventful. And I turned slightly, offering a small nod in greeting, which they returned in kind, the exchange brief, polite, and distant. Ashley glanced at the counter, her eyes flicking toward the folded paper before returning to me, and there was a subtle pause, just long enough to register that she was waiting for some form of acknowledgement, some indication that I had accepted what had been written. And I met her gaze, calmly, offering nothing more than the same composed expression I had carried since the night before. and after a moment she looked away, continuing with her routine as if the silence between us had confirmed what she needed it to. Daniel moved to the refrigerator, pulling it open and scanning its contents with the same familiar gesture he had used since he was a teenager, and for a brief second I watched him, not with judgment, but with a kind of distant recognition, as if I were seeing him from a place slightly removed, and I wondered how much of this he truly understood, how much he chose not to see, and whether it mattered anymore. I finished my coffee and set the cup down gently in the sink, rinsing it out with the same care I applied to everything else, and as I dried it and placed it back in the cabinet, I felt that steady clarity return, the same one that had settled over me the night before. Only now it felt stronger, more defined, and I knew that whatever they believed about the days ahead, whatever expectations they had quietly built around me, those expectations were based on an assumption that no longer held true. I walked past the counter once more, my hand brushing lightly against the surface as I moved toward the hallway, and I did not pick up the list again, did not comment on it, did not ask any questions, because there was nothing I needed from it, nothing it could offer that I had not already understood. And as I made my way back toward the stairs, I realized that the shift I had felt the night before had not faded with the morning. It had settled in, become something stable, something I could carry forward without effort. And for the first time in a long while, I was not thinking about how to maintain what had been. I was thinking about what would come next, and how quietly, how carefully I intended to shape it. The rest of the morning unfolded with a quiet kind of observation, the kind that does not announce itself but lingers in the background of every movement. And I found myself noticing things I had long overlooked. The way Ashley moved through the house with a sense of ownership that extended beyond habit. The way she opened cabinets without hesitation, rearranged small items on the counter as if adjusting details that had never belonged to anyone else. And Daniel followed her rhythm without question, his presence aligned with hers in a way that felt less like partnership and more like quiet agreement. I moved through my own routine just as deliberately, not avoiding them, not engaging more than necessary, simply existing within the same space while holding on to a distance that had not been there before, and it was in that distance that things became clearer, sharper, easier to understand without the need for explanation. By mid-morning, they had settled into the living room again, discussing travel details in a tone that suggested excitement layered over careful planning. Words about departure times, reservations, confirmations, all spoken with the ease of people who believed everything was already arranged, and I passed through the room once, carrying a small stack of folded laundry, my presence acknowledged only briefly before the conversation resumed, uninterrupted, as if I were part of the background rather than the center of it. I placed the laundry in the hallway closet and paused for a moment, listening, not with curiosity but with intention, and this time their voices were clearer, less guarded, the assumption of privacy perhaps making them less careful, and Ashley spoke first, her tone steady, practical. "It will give us time to get everything set up without interruptions," she said, and Daniel responded with a quiet agreement, followed by a question about timing, about how long it would take to prepare the space. And Ashley answered without hesitation, "A week is enough, if everything is handled while we are gone." And there was a small pause before she added, "She will not question it, she never does." And I stood there, just beyond the doorway, absorbing the words not as a shock, but as confirmation, a final piece settling into a pattern that had already formed. I stepped away before the conversation could shift again, before the tone could change, and I continued down the hallway, my steps even, my breathing steady, because there was no need to confront what had already revealed itself so clearly. And as I reached the end of the hall, I stopped in front of the small office room, the one that had once been shared space, a place for paperwork, for organizing the details of life that rarely drew attention but held everything together behind the scenes. I opened the door and stepped inside, closing it quietly behind me, and the room felt unchanged, the desk in its usual place, the filing cabinet tucked neatly against the wall, the faint scent of paper and wood lingering in the air, and I moved toward the cabinet, pulling open the drawer with a sense of familiarity that did not require thought, because this was where I had always kept things in order, where records were stored, where details were preserved even when no one else considered them important. I slid the folders aside one by one, scanning labels, recognizing dates, until I reached the documents I had reviewed the night before, and I took them out again, placing them on the desk, smoothing the pages flat with my hands as if reaffirming their presence, their validity, their permanence. I sat down and read through them once more, not out of doubt, but out of precision, allowing each line to settle into memory, each clause to take its place in the larger understanding I was building. And as I did, I felt that same calm deepen, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what is real and what is assumed. And I realized that the difference between those two things was where everything now rested. I reached for the phone on the desk and paused for a moment, my fingers hovering just above it, not out of hesitation, but out of consideration, because what I was about to do did not need to be rushed. It needed to be deliberate, measured, aligned with the clarity I had already found. And after a second, I picked it up and dialed a number I had not used in some time, one that had once been part of routine conversations, one that had handled matters quietly and professionally without unnecessary attention. The call connected after a few rings, and I spoke in a calm, even tone, introducing myself, stating that I would like to review some documents and discuss a few updates. Nothing urgent, nothing alarming, just a request made with the same composed confidence I had carried throughout the morning. And as I listened to the response on the other end, scheduling a meeting, confirming a time, I felt no sense of urgency, no rush to act beyond what was necessary, because the situation did not require reaction. It required understanding, and understanding had already taken root. When I ended the call, I placed the phone back on the desk and gathered the papers carefully, returning them to their folder, aligning the edges before placing them back into the cabinet. Not hidden, not concealed, but stored with intention. And as I closed the drawer, I knew that whatever plans had been made without me, whatever assumptions had been quietly built around my role, they were no longer the only plans in motion. And this time, I was not simply observing the direction things were taking. I was shaping it, quietly, deliberately, in a way that required no announcement, only action. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning, just 2 days after the holiday, and I did not mention it to anyone, not because I was hiding something, but because there was no need to introduce a conversation that would only invite questions I had no intention of answering yet. And the rest of Sunday passed in a steady rhythm of preparation, not the kind Ashley had outlined on her list, but my own quiet preparation, the kind that happens beneath the surface, unnoticed, unannounced. I moved through the house with the same familiar care, straightening small things, adjusting what needed adjusting, but not in service of their expectations, rather in recognition of what this place had always meant to me. And I noticed how Ashley watched me at times, brief glances that carried a hint of approval, as if she believed I was already stepping into the role she had assigned, and I allowed that assumption to remain untouched, because correcting it would serve no purpose yet. Monday morning came with a shift in energy, the kind that always accompanies departure, suitcases appearing in the hallway, the sound of zippers, the quiet urgency of last-minute packing, and I stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, observing without intrusion, as Daniel checked his phone repeatedly, confirming times, while Ashley moved with practiced efficiency, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked, her movements sharp, precise, confident. "We will be leaving before sunrise," she said at one point, her voice carrying across the room without looking directly at me, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging the information without adding anything further, and Daniel glanced at me briefly, as if considering whether to say more, but whatever thought crossed his mind passed quickly, replaced by the ease of silence that had become so natural between us. The list remained on the counter, unchanged, its presence almost symbolic now, and as they moved around it, neither of them felt the need to revisit it, because in their minds, it had already been accepted, already set into motion, and I continued my morning as usual, rinsing my cup, placing it back in the cabinet, my movements steady, unhurried, each action grounded in a calm that had settled deeper with each passing hour. The car was loaded just after 6 in the morning, the faint light of dawn stretching across the driveway, and I stood by the front door. As they gathered their things, Ashley adjusting her coat, Daniel checking the trunk one last time, and there was a brief moment where it felt as though something might be said, some acknowledgement, some recognition of the shift that had taken place, but it did not come, and instead, Ashley offered a small, polite smile. Everything should be fine, she said, her tone light, almost reassuring, as if she were leaving behind a responsibility she trusted would be handled, and I returned the smile. With the same quiet composure, "Have a safe trip," I replied, my voice even, steady, carrying no weight beyond the words themselves. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand resting on the doorframe, and he looked at me with something that might have been uncertainty, or perhaps just habit, and then he nodded, a small, almost automatic gesture, before turning away and following Ashley outside. And I watched as they walked to the car, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of shared understanding, shared intention, and the engine started with a low hum, the sound lingering for a moment before fading as they pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. I closed the door gently, the latch clicking into place with a finality that felt both familiar and new, and I stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the wood, listening to the quiet that followed, not empty, not heavy, but open, like a space that had been waiting to be filled. Differently, I turned and walked back into the kitchen, the house settling around me in a way that felt unchanged on the surface, yet entirely different beneath it, and the list was still there, exactly where it had been left, and I approached it once more, picking it up and reading through it again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it with the clarity I now held. Each line no longer an instruction, but a reflection of an assumption that had already been challenged. I folded the paper carefully and set it aside, not in the center of the counter this time, but off to the side, a small shift in placement that carried its own quiet meaning, and I moved toward the hallway, my steps steady, purposeful, as I made my way to the office, where the documents remained exactly as I had left them, and I opened the drawer, retrieving the folder with a sense of calm certainty, because now the house was truly quiet, not just in sound, but in presence, and the time for observation had passed, replaced by the time for action, measured, deliberate, and entirely my own. The house felt different once the silence settled fully, not just quieter, but more defined, as if every room had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long, and I moved through it slowly that morning, not out of hesitation but with intention, allowing myself to see it not as something shared or negotiated, but as something that had always been mine to understand more deeply than anyone else. The folder rested in my hands as I walked into the office, and I placed it on the desk with a careful precision, opening it once more, not to reread every line again, but to confirm what I already knew, that the foundation beneath everything had never shifted, only the perception of it had. And I reached for the phone, dialing the number I had arranged the day before, my voice steady as I confirmed the appointment and then gathered the documents I would need, placing them into a simple leather bag that had belonged to my husband, the one he used for important matters, the one that had always carried a quiet sense of purpose. The drive into town was uneventful, the roads familiar, the early morning traffic light, and I found a certain comfort in that familiarity, in the way the world continued at its usual pace regardless of the shifts taking place within a single household. And when I arrived, I parked in the same spot I had used years before, stepping out with the same composed posture I had carried since the night of that dinner, not rushed, not uncertain, simply present. The office itself had not changed much, the same neutral decor, the same quiet professionalism, and when I was greeted, it was with recognition that did not require explanation, my name still carrying the weight of previous conversations, previous arrangements, and I sat down across from the desk, placing the folder in front of me, opening it with a calm that felt almost effortless now. The discussion that followed was not emotional, not dramatic, but precise, each detail addressed clearly, each question answered with certainty, and I listened carefully as options were outlined, as confirmations were made, as the structure of ownership and control was reaffirmed in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. And when it came time to make decisions, I did not hesitate, because hesitation belongs to doubt, and doubt had already been replaced by clarity. Papers were reviewed, small adjustments suggested, and I considered each one not as a reaction to what had happened, but as a continuation of what had always been intended, ensuring that everything was aligned not with assumption, but with reality, and when I signed where necessary, my hand moved without tremor, the pen gliding across the page with a steady confidence that felt both familiar and newly grounded. When I left the office, the air outside felt sharper, cleaner, and I paused for a moment beside my car, looking out at the street, the quiet movement of people going about their day, unaware of the shift that had just taken place in a small room behind me. And I realized that this was how change often happens, not with noise or confrontation, but with quiet decisions made in the right place at the right time. I returned home in the same measured way, the drive back carrying none of the weight that might have once accompanied such an errand. And when I stepped inside, the house greeted me with that same open stillness, but now it felt different again, not just open, but settled, as if something had been placed firmly back into its proper position. I set the leather bag down in the office and returned the folder to its place, aligning it carefully within the drawer, not hidden, not concealed, but stored with the same intention it had always carried. And I closed the drawer with a soft, deliberate motion, the sound marking not an end, but a continuation. The rest of the day unfolded quietly. I moved through the rooms with a renewed sense of awareness, not adjusting things for appearance, not maintaining for others, but simply existing within the space on my own terms. And when I passed the kitchen counter, the list was still there, slightly shifted from where I had placed it earlier, its presence now almost insignificant, and I picked it up one last time, reading through the lines without emotion, before folding it once more and placing it neatly into a drawer, not discarded, not destroyed, but removed from view in a way that reflected its true place in my life. As the afternoon light stretched across the floor, I stood by the window again, looking out at the yard, the garden, the familiar lines of a life that had been carefully built over decades, and I understood that whatever expectations had been placed upon me, whatever roles had been quietly assigned, they no longer held the same weight, because the foundation beneath them had been clarified, secured, and reinforced in a way that required no explanation to anyone else. And as I turned away from the window, moving back into the house with steady steps, I knew that when they returned, they would not be stepping back into the same arrangement they had left behind, even if they did not yet realize it. The days passed with a quiet rhythm that no longer felt like waiting, but like preparation, each morning unfolding with the same steady clarity, each evening settling into a calm that did not need to be filled. And I moved through the house not as someone maintaining it for others, but as someone re-establishing a sense of place that had been quietly challenged and now firmly restored. I did not follow the list they had left behind, not in the way it had been written, but I did what I had always done, tending to the home in ways that reflected care rather than obligation, choosing what mattered and leaving the rest untouched. And there was a subtle difference in that, one that only I could fully understand, because it was not about the tasks themselves, it was about the intention behind them. By the time the week came to an end, the house was exactly as it should be, not because I had followed instructions, but because I had never needed them in the first place. And when the sound of a car pulling into the driveway finally broke the quiet on Sunday afternoon, I was already in the living room, seated in the same armchair by the window, a book resting closed in my lap, my posture relaxed, composed, as if nothing had changed at all. The front door opened with the familiar sound of keys and footsteps, voices carrying a light energy that spoke of a trip enjoyed, of time spent away without interruption. And Ashley entered first, her tone bright, her movements confident, followed by Daniel with the same easy familiarity, and for a brief moment, everything appeared exactly as it had before they left, as if the space had remained unchanged, waiting for them to return to their version of it. "We are back," Ashley said, setting her bag down near the door, her eyes moving quickly through the room, taking in the details, assessing without appearing to, and I looked up from my chair, offering a small, polite smile. "I can see that," I replied, my voice calm. Even carrying no trace of tension or expectation, Daniel stepped further inside, glancing around with a quieter expression, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual, as if he were trying to place something that felt slightly different, though nothing obvious had been altered. And Ashley moved past him into the kitchen, her steps quick, purposeful, and I could hear the faint sound of drawers opening, cabinets shifting, her movements scanning the space in a way that suggested she was looking for confirmation, not of cleanliness, but of control. There, Was a pause, just a brief one, before she returned to the doorway, her expression still composed but carrying a subtle edge of uncertainty. "Everything looks fine," she said, though the words felt more like a statement to herself than to me, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging without elaboration, because there was nothing that needed to be explained. Daniel set his keys down on the table and looked at me again, his eyes searching in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if he were noticing something that had always been there, but had only now come into focus. And he opened his mouth as if to speak, then paused, the words unformed, replaced by a quiet that settled between us. Ashley crossed her arms, lightly, her posture shifting just enough to reveal that something was not aligning with her expectations, and she glanced once more toward the kitchen, then back at me. "Did you get everything on the list done?" she asked, her tone still controlled, but now more direct, the question no longer implied but spoken. I met her gaze without hesitation, my expression steady, and I answered simply. I took care of what needed to be taken care of, and the room fell into a brief, measured silence, not tense, not dramatic, but clear, like a line that had been quietly drawn and now stood visible to anyone willing to see it. Ashley held my gaze for a moment longer, as if weighing the meaning behind my words, as if searching for something she could challenge or redirect, but there was nothing there for her to grasp, no uncertainty, no invitation, only a calm certainty that did not require reinforcement, and she looked away first, her attention shifting back toward the kitchen, though her movements had lost some of their earlier confidence. Daniel remained where he was, his posture still, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested something had shifted beyond his immediate understanding, and I could see the hesitation in him now, the space where assumption had once been, and I did not fill that space, did not offer explanation or reassurance, because this was not something that needed to be smoothed over or resolved in a single moment. I stood slowly from the chair, placing the book on the side table, and I moved past them toward the hallway with the same quiet composure I had carried throughout the week, my steps unhurried, my presence steady, and as I reached the edge of the room, I paused briefly, not turning back, but allowing the silence to settle once more, and in that silence, there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable, a recognition that the arrangement they had left behind no longer existed in the same form. I continued down the hallway without another word, leaving them in the space they had assumed would remain unchanged, and as I walked, I understood that what had been set in motion did not need to be announced. It would reveal itself in time, in actions, in outcomes, in the quiet unfolding of decisions already made. And for the first time in a long while, I did not feel the need to hold everything together for everyone else, because I had already secured what mattered, and the rest would follow on its own. This emotional family story follows an elderly mother who is quietly humiliated during a holiday dinner when her daughter-in-law leaves behind a message that redefines her place in the home, turning a moment of warmth into a realization of control and manipulation. As the family story unfolds, the elderly mother begins to notice patterns of exclusion and subtle disrespect that have built over time, while the daughter-in-law confidently assumes authority and the son remains distant and passive. What begins as a painful moment becomes a powerful internal shift as the elderly mother moves from silent endurance to calm awareness, uncovering deeper intentions behind a planned trip that leaves her behind to maintain the household. Through this family story, the narrative explores emotional resilience, generational tension, and the quiet strength of a woman who refuses to be diminished. As days pass in silence, the elderly mother takes deliberate steps to reclaim her position, reviewing documents, seeking clarity, and preparing for a future where she is no longer overlooked. The family story reaches a turning point when the household dynamics subtly shift, and the daughter-in-law begins to sense that her assumptions may no longer hold power. Upon their return, the tension becomes visible in small exchanges, where calm responses from the elderly mother signal a deeper change beneath the surface. This family story highlights the contrast between expectation and reality, showing how control can be challenged without confrontation. In the end, the elderly mother stands grounded in her own space, no longer defined by the roles imposed on her, while the daughter-in-law faces a quiet but undeniable shift in authority, leaving the future of their relationship uncertain but forever changed. Character 1. A 68-year-old white elderly woman with calm expression and silver hair neatly styled, wearing modest, elegant sweater and skirt. Facing forward, direct gaze. Realistic lighting. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Character 2. A 35-year-old white woman with sharp features, confident expression, and styled blonde hair. Wearing modern fitted outfit. Facing forward, direct gaze. Realistic lighting. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. 1. A tense cinematic Thanksgiving dining room scene at night, with warm golden lighting reflecting off a polished wooden table. The elderly mother stands upright, holding a small card in her hand, her face calm, but eyes sharp, showing controlled emotion, while the daughter-in-law stands across from her, with a confident, cold expression, arms slightly crossed, her posture assertive. The son sits between them, looking down, avoiding eye contact, creating visible tension in the composition. The camera angle is frontal, capturing both women facing each other like a silent duel. The atmosphere heavy with emotional conflict, no movement, only psychological confrontation. Realistic lighting, detailed environment. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. No cartoon. 1. 2. A peaceful early morning kitchen scene filled with soft natural sunlight streaming through a window, illuminating the elderly mother standing near the counter preparing coffee. Her silver hair neatly styled, her expression calm, reflective, and slightly distant. She wears modest, elegant home clothing. The background shows a warm, lived-in American home with clean counters, a kettle, and a small garden visible through the window, while in the far background, slightly out of focus, the daughter-in-law passes by confidently with a neutral expression, checking her phone, emphasizing contrast in personality. The camera angle is frontal, focused on the elderly mother, capturing her quiet routine and emotional depth. Realistic atmosphere. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. No cartoon. 1. 2. 3. A modern, stylish kitchen scene during daytime, with bright, clean lighting. The daughter-in-law stands near a marble counter, holding her phone, her posture straight and confident, her expression focused, slightly calculating. She is dressed in a fitted modern outfit, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She adjusts items on the counter with controlled, precise movements, while in the background, the elderly mother is visible, blurred, standing still, observing quietly, her presence subtle but emotionally significant. The camera captures a frontal perspective, highlighting the daughter-in-law as dominant in her environment, while tension is implied through composition. Realistic interior details. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. No cartoon. 1. 2. 4. A dramatic living room confrontation scene with soft evening lighting casting shadows across the space. The elderly mother stands near the doorway, calm, composed, her posture upright, her face emotionless yet strong, while the daughter-in-law sits on the couch, leaning forward, speaking with assertive body language, her expression controlled and confident. The son sits beside her, slightly withdrawn, creating imbalance. The elderly mother and daughter-in-law visually oppose each other across the room. The camera is frontal, capturing both women in one frame, emphasizing tension and power. Contrast. The room filled with subtle details like framed photos and soft furniture. Realistic cinematic tone. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. No cartoon. 1. 2. 5. A quiet office interior scene with natural daylight filtering through blinds, casting soft lines across a wooden desk. The elderly mother sits focused, reviewing documents, her expression calm, determined, her posture steady and composed. Papers neatly arranged in front of her. She holds a pen and a phone nearby, signaling strategic action. In the background, slightly blurred, the daughter-in-law appears, standing at a distance, observing with a neutral but guarded expression, adding tension. The camera angle frontal, centered on the elderly mother, highlighting her silent transformation and control. The environment realistic with subtle textures and depth. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. No cartoon. 1. 2. 6. A final cinematic homecoming scene at the front entrance of a suburban house during late afternoon light. The door open as the daughter-in-law steps inside confidently, but pauses, sensing change. Her expression shifts from relaxed to uncertain, while the elderly mother stands in the living room facing her directly, calm, composed, and unshaken, her posture upright, conveying quiet authority. The space looks identical, yet emotionally transformed. The camera captures both women in a frontal balanced frame, emphasizing the shift in power. The sun stands slightly behind, unsure, adding depth to the scene. Realistic lighting, detailed environment, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon, no cartoon. 1, 2.